On the 23rd of October, 1983, a prison guard walks down a narrow concrete corridor in Marion, Illinois. He stops in front of a steel door. Inside the cell, a man has not touched another human being in weeks. The slot opens. Breakfast slides through. The door never does. This is the story of solitary confinement. For most of human history, prisons were loud places, crowded cells, chain gangs, public punishments. But in the late 1700s, a new idea emerged. Maybe isolation could reform people. Maybe silence could force reflection. Religious groups in the United States believed criminals could become morally pure if separated from the corruption of society. They called it penitence. It is where the word penitentiary comes from. In 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary opened in Philadelphia. The prison was revolutionary. Every prisoner lived alone. They ate alone, worked alone, slept alone. Guards even covered inmates' heads when moving them through hallways so they could not see each other. The designers believed silence would create remorse. Instead, many prisoners mentally collapsed. Visitors described inmates whispering to walls and pacing in circles for hours. One man reportedly stared at a drain for days. Another laughed uncontrollably through the night. Charles Dickens toured the prison in 1842 and called the system cruel and wrong. He wrote that the punishment was worse than physical torture because it destroyed the mind quietly. Eventually, many countries reduced the practice, but solitary confinement never disappeared. It evolved. Today, the United States holds more prisoners in long-term isolation than any democracy on earth. Exact numbers are difficult to verify because reporting standards vary by state, but estimates suggest tens of thousands of inmates spend over 22 hours a day alone. Some remain isolated for years, others for decades. The modern supermax prison was designed to perfect this system. Florence, Colorado, ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. From above, the facility resembles a concrete fortress dropped into the desert. Motion sensors, steel fencing, guard towers. Inside are men considered too dangerous to house anywhere else. Terrorists, gang leaders, escape artists, killers of prison staff. Most inmates spend nearly all day inside a single concrete room. The cells are around 7 by 12 feet. A poured concrete bed, a steel toilet, a small desk fixed to the wall. Windows are narrow and angled upward, so prisoners cannot see the mountains outside. Some inmates describe losing track of seasons entirely. Meals arrive through slots in the doors. Recreation happens alone in concrete enclosures, sometimes called dog runs. Human interaction is minimal and tightly controlled. The prison was intentionally engineered to reduce unpredictability. In many ways, it functions less like a traditional prison and more like a human containment system. Officials argue that solitary confinement protects both guards and inmates. Certain prisoners organize murders from inside prison walls. Some assault staff repeatedly. Others target vulnerable inmates. Isolation, according to prison administrators, prevents chaos. And there is evidence supporting that argument. In the 1980s, violence inside American prisons surged. Gang structures became stronger. Assaults on correctional officers increased. The federal prison in Marion, Illinois, entered permanent lockdown after 2 guards were murdered in separate incidents on the same day. Prison officials concluded that some inmates could no longer be managed through conventional incarceration. That logic eventually helped create the supermax era. But critics argue that the psychological cost is catastrophic. Humans are social organisms. The brain expects stimulation, conversation, facial expressions, movement, touch. Solitary confinement strips most of that away. Former inmates describe hearing phantom voices. Some report panic attacks and memory loss. Others develop hypersensitivity to sound. A coughing fit in another cell can become unbearable. Footsteps echo differently. Time itself starts to feel unstable. Psychologists have documented hallucinations, paranoia, depression, and cognitive decline in isolated prisoners. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who studied solitary confinement extensively, observed a syndrome involving perceptual distortions, obsessive thoughts, and severe anxiety. In some cases, prisoners became incapable of normal social interaction after prolonged isolation. The effects can appear surprisingly quickly. In one study, healthy volunteers placed in isolation began struggling with concentration after only a few days. Prison environments intensify those effects further because the isolation is involuntary, indefinite, and often combined with stress or fear. And and yet solitary confinement remains deeply embedded in prison systems around the world. Part of the reason is logistical. Prisons are overcrowded, staff shortages are common. Mentally ill inmates can become difficult to manage in general populations. Solitary confinement offers administrators control. A prisoner in a locked cell cannot immediately attack another inmate. They cannot coordinate riots easily. They cannot move freely. But the system also creates a paradox. Many prisoners eventually leave solitary confinement and return directly to society. Imagine spending years in near-total isolation and then suddenly walking into a crowded city. Traffic noise, bright lights, human conversation, phones ringing, grocery stores, families. The transition can be psychologically overwhelming. Some former inmates compare it to emerging from another planet. One prisoner held in isolation for over 2 decades described becoming anxious during simple conversations. Another said eye contact felt physically painful after years without normal interaction. This has raised a difficult question. If the purpose of prison is rehabilitation, what exactly does prolonged isolation rehabilitate? Several countries reach their own conclusions. Norway largely rejects long-term solitary confinement. Its prison philosophy focuses heavily on normalization. Inmates retain access to social activities, education, and communal spaces. Violence rates inside Norwegian prisons are significantly lower than many systems built around punishment-first models. But comparisons are complicated. Norway has a far smaller prison population, lower violent crime rates, different social structures, different sentencing laws. Critics argue that policies successful in Scandinavia may not scale effectively to massive prison systems like the United States. Meanwhile, countries including the United Kingdom and Canada have faced increasing legal pressure over isolation practices. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture stated that prolonged solitary confinement exceeding 15 days could constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The reasoning was based partly on evidence suggesting that psychological damage can become irreversible after extended periods. Some prison systems responded with reforms. Others changed terminology instead. Administrative segregation, restrictive housing, special management units, different names, similar conditions. The debate became even more complicated when solitary confinement intersected with mental illness. A disproportionate number of isolated inmates suffer from psychiatric disorders. Some prisons use segregation to separate prisoners experiencing psychotic episodes or extreme behavioral instability. But isolation can intensify those symptoms dramatically. In certain cases, inmates self-harm, known repeatedly inside solitary units. Some swallow batteries or razor blades. Others bang their heads against walls for hours. Correctional officers in multiple facilities describe cells covered in blood or feces after mental breakdowns. And prisons are often unequipped to treat severe psychiatric illness effectively. The United States gradually closed many state psychiatric hospitals during the second half of the 20th century. Large numbers of mentally ill individuals eventually entered jails and prisons instead. Today, correctional facilities house one of the largest concentrations of mentally ill people in the country. That means solitary confinement increasingly functions not only as punishment, but also as improvised behavioral management, sometimes indefinitely. Khalif Browder became one of the most widely known examples. In 2010, Browder was arrested in New York at age 16 after being accused of stealing a backpack. He denied the accusation. Unable to afford bail, he spent around 3 years on Rikers Island awaiting trial. Roughly 2 of those years were spent in solitary confinement. The charges were eventually dropped. After his release, Browder struggled psychologically. In interviews, he described paranoia and trauma from isolation. In 2015, he died by suicide. His case intensified national scrutiny around solitary confinement, especially involving juveniles. But even as reforms expanded in some states, supermax facilities and restrictive housing units continued operating across the country because prison systems face another uncomfortable reality. Some inmates genuinely are extremely dangerous. Thomas Silverstein spent decades in federal solitary confinement after killing prison staff. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was held under highly restrictive conditions due to escape risks. Ramzi Youssef, one of the architects of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, remains housed under strict isolation. For prison administrators, these cases become central arguments. The public rarely sees those internal calculations. Most solitary confinement units are inaccessible to journalists. Photography is limited. Surveillance footage is controlled by prison authorities. Much of what the outside world understands about isolation comes from lawsuits, testimonies, leaked reports, and former inmates, which creates another strange aspect of solitary confinement. It is both highly visible and largely invisible. Everyone knows prisons exist. Very few people know what prolonged isolation actually looks like. A steel door, fluorescent lights, concrete, silence, and time. Lots of time. The modern prison system depends heavily on separation. Separation from society. Separation from victims. Separation from freedom. Solitary confinement pushes that logic to its furthest point. Not just separating prisoners from the public, separating them from almost everyone. On paper, the practice is often described with clinical language. Security housing, behavioral control, risk management. But inside the cells, the experience is deeply human. A man counting footsteps, another talking to insects, someone pressing their ear against a steel door, hoping to hear another voice. And the debate surrounding solitary confinement may ultimately reveal something larger than prison policy itself. Every society creates systems for dealing with people it fears. The question is not whether dangerous individuals exist. The question is how far a civilization is willing to go to contain them. Because somewhere tonight, a food tray will slide through another steel slot. A fluorescent light will continue buzzing overhead. And someone will sit alone in a concrete room, waiting for a door that just may not open for years.